When we think about India's fight for freedom, the 1857 revolt usually comes to mind first. But what if I told you that decades before that, another fire was already burning? For 40 long years, a really surprising group of people waged one of the very first organized rebellions against British rule. This is the story of the Sanyasi Rebellion.
And that's the big question, isn't it? How does a tragedy like a famine spark a war that lasts for 4 decades? The answer is a wild story of greed, sheer desperation, and an alliance of people you'd never expect to see fighting side by side. And it all starts not on a battlefield, but in the way the system was set up.
To really get what happened, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to look at the system the British East India Company created in Bengal. And trust me, it wasn't just flawed, it was practically designed to exploit people. It was a perfect storm, just waiting to happen.
Okay, so the British came up with this genius, and I mean brutally genius idea called dual government. Here's how it worked. The company got all the power that mattered, collecting all the money, all the taxes. But they took zero responsibility for anything else, like running the place or taking care of the people. They just left that part to the local ruler, the Nawab, who now had all the duties, but none of the cash to actually do his job. It was a recipe for total disaster.
And yeah, a disaster is exactly what they got. With nobody really in charge and the company only caring about its profits, corruption just exploded. Tax collectors started squeezing the peasants for every last penny to meet the company's insane demands. The result? People were buried under crushing debt and the entire region was plunged into economic misery.
So the people of Bengal were already at their absolute limit. They were barely holding on. And then, in 1770, came the final straw, the breaking point. A catastrophe so huge it turned all that quiet suffering into an open rebellion. Just look at that number, 1/3. Seriously, let that sink in for a second. 1 out of every 3 people in Bengal died. This wasn't just a bad year, this was a tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale, one of the worst famines the region had ever seen.
But here's the part that is just absolutely staggering. As millions of people were literally starving to death, the East India Company's priority never changed. They didn't offer help. They didn't lower the taxes. No, they kept demanding their money from a population that had nothing left to give. And that cold, brutal indifference, that was the spark that lit the fuse.
So what happened next wasn't just one group of angry farmers. No, this rebellion was something totally different. It was a huge social alliance, a coalition of people from all walks of life, all pushed to the edge, who decided enough is enough, we're fighting back together.
And when you look at who was actually fighting, it's just incredible. This wasn't just one group. You had Hindu, Sanyasis, and Muslim Fakirs, these are religious figures, fighting right alongside starving peasants. You had soldiers who had been fired from the local army, teaming up with rich landowners. Each of them had their own reasons for being angry, but they all had one enemy in common, a system that was destroying all of them.
And let's be really clear here. Even though there were religious groups involved, this wasn't fundamentally a religious war. At its heart, this was a united fight against economic oppression. Plain and simple, it was a fight for survival.
So, you've got this ragtag coalition of monks, farmers, and ex-soldiers. How in the world do they fight back against the most powerful and wealthy company on Earth? Well, their tactics were smart and desperate, and the British response was just plain brutal.
The rebels knew they couldn't win a head-on battle, so they waged a guerrilla war. They hit the company where it hurt the most, its wallet. They launched raids on company factories, they seized grain storage, and they went after the tax collectors who were making their lives a living hell. The British, led by guys like Warren Hastings, came back with everything they had, overwhelming military power and a ruthless campaign to crush the rebellion for good.
So by the early 1800s, after decades of fighting, the rebellion was finally put down. On the surface, it looked like a failure. They didn't kick the British out, but its story didn't die there. In fact, you could say its most powerful chapter was just beginning.
Just check out how the story evolves. The fighting itself stops around 1802, and for almost 80 years, the story kind of fades. But then, in 1882, a writer named Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya brings it roaring back to life in his novel Anand-Math. And a song from that book, Vande Mataram, goes on to become the anthem, the rallying cry for a whole new generation of freedom fighters. It directly connects this early economic fight to the huge national struggle for independence in the 20th century.
So, why are we talking about this today? Why does it matter?
Well, it's a huge reminder that resistance to colonial rules started way earlier than we often think. It shows us how economic injustice can bring people from totally different worlds together. And maybe most importantly, its legacy proves that even a rebellion that fails can plant the seeds of an idea that can grow and one day become powerful enough to topple an empire.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? The story of the Sanyasis was almost lost forever, but it was reborn as a national symbol. And that just leaves us with this one big question. How many other forgotten rebellions, how many other struggles for justice are buried in the past, their roots still quietly shaping the world we live in right now?